Today, we're diving into a document that's shaking the foundations of the transatlantic alliance. We're examining accusations that Europe is facing civilizational collapse within a generation. We're unpacking America's dramatic pivot away from its oldest partners. And we're revealing what happens when a superpower decides its allies have become liabilities. But here's the thing, the most startling revelation in all of this, I've saved that for the very end of this episode. I spent years inside one of the big establishment media operations, watching how stories got shaped, how narratives got massaged to fit what the powers above wanted you to believe. One day I looked at what I was being asked to present, and I couldn't do it anymore, so I walked away. Now I operate independently from Europe, and I tell you what's actually happening, not what someone wants you to think is happening, and that brings me to you. If you find value in this kind of straight talk, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you're able, consider sponsoring us. We put serious effort into fact-checking every claim, verifying every source, because we refuse to spread misinformation or become just another echo chamber. Your support helps us maintain that standard. And truly, stick with me until the end today, because what I'm about to reveal gets more remarkable with every minute. Late Thursday evening, the White House released a document that nobody saw coming. 33 pages of text that read less like a security strategy and more like a funeral announcement for the Western alliance. This wasn't some leaked memo or anonymous policy paper. This was the official national security strategy of the United States, dated November 2025, with a foreword signed by Donald Trump himself, calling it a roadmap for preserving American greatness. Except the roadmap doesn't lead to unity with long-standing partners. It leads straight to a verdict that Europe, the continent that helped birth the modern democratic world, is dying. The document doesn't mince words. It states plainly that Europe is experiencing what it calls civilizational erasure, and if current trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable within 20 years, maybe sooner. The culprits, according to this strategy, mass migration, collapsing birth rates, and something they term the loss of civilizational confidence. Now, before you think this is just some policy wonk's abstract concern, understand what this means in practice. The United States, through an official government document, is essentially writing off its most important allies as unreliable, weakened, and heading toward irrelevance. Former European leaders didn't take this quietly. Carl Bildt, who served as Sweden's prime minister, called the document delirium, said it sounded like something you'd hear from the Kremlin, not from Washington. Think about that for a moment. A former head of government from a NATO country is saying that America's security strategy reads like Russian propaganda. Other officials echoed similar shock, pointing out that the language, the framing, the entire tone resembled what Vladimir Putin has been saying about the West for years. So what exactly did this document say that triggered such an explosive response? Let's get into the details. The strategy doesn't just mention migration as a challenge, it frames it as an existential threat to European civilization itself. The text cites specific figures to back up its alarm. It claims that one asylum seeker cost the Netherlands €475,000. That illegal migration cost France €1.8 billion in 2023 alone, and that in Denmark and Germany, migrants from non-Western countries commit a disproportionate share of violent offenses. The document also references coordinated violent acts carried out across the continent by individuals who arrived as migrants. These aren't presented as isolated incidents, but as evidence of a pattern, a systemic breakdown. But here's where it gets particularly inflammatory. The strategy argues that several NATO members could become majority non-European in population within the coming decades, and it questions whether such countries can remain reliable allies. Read that again. The official position of the United States government, as stated in this document, is that demographic change might make some European NATO members untrustworthy partners. Critics immediately recognized this language. It mirrors something called the Great Replacement Theory, a concept that claims migration represents a coordinated plot to replace native European populations with people from other regions. This theory has been widely discredited as rooted in prejudice and has unfortunately inspired violent extremism in the past. So why would an American administration adopt this framing? The document makes the case that mass migration, as it describes it, drains resources, amplifies violence and other offenses, weakens social cohesion, distorts markets, and threatens national security in countries worldwide. This isn't presented as opinion. It's presented as established fact, as the foundation for a major strategic shift. And the shift is this: Europe is no longer seen as a strong, reliable partner capable of defending democratic values. Instead, it's seen as a continent in decline, Ukraine, unable or unwilling to confront its own challenges. What's especially striking is how little the document focuses on Russia. You'd expect a U.S. national security strategy to position Moscow as a primary adversary, especially given the ongoing situation in Ukraine. But Russia barely appears as a threat in this text. Instead, European governments themselves are accused of undermining democratic processes, of pursuing unrealistic objectives in supporting Ukraine, and of failing to defend their own territory. The implication is clear. Washington believes that Europe's problems are self-inflicted, that European elites have lost their way, and that continuing to support them as they are might not serve American interests. Now, there's a section in the document titled Advancing European Greatness, which sounds positive until you read what it actually says. It describes the European Union's economic decline as worsened by changing ethnic composition, falling birth rates, loss of identity, and what it calls regulatory strangulation from Brussels. The EU itself is labeled anti-democratic, with its attempts to regulate member states portrayed as threats to freedom and sovereignty. Then comes something truly remarkable. The document expresses support for what it calls patriotic European parties, saying their growing influence gives reason for great optimism. Translation: the White House is publicly endorsing right-wing movements across Europe, the very forces that mainstream institutions have been trying to marginalize for years. Think about what this represents. The United States, historically the anchor of the transatlantic alliance, is now saying it sees hope not in the established European order, but in the populist and nationalist movements challenging that order. This isn't a subtle policy adjustment. This is a complete inversion of decades of American foreign policy. And it gets even more dramatic when you look at what the strategy proposes for America's own priorities. The document announces that the United States intends to reduce its presence in regions of the world that are less important to national security than before, and to concentrate instead on the Western Hemisphere. This is where the Trump addition to the Monroe Doctrine comes in. For those unfamiliar, the original Monroe Doctrine, dating back to 1823, essentially declared the Americas off-limits to European colonization and interference. What the new strategy proposes is a modern version. After years of neglect, as the document puts it, the United States plans to restore and enforce this doctrine to reassert American dominance in the region and protect the homeland. Specifically, it means preventing China and Russia from placing forces or infrastructure anywhere in Latin America or the Caribbean. The concrete measures outlined are striking. The strategy calls for reallocating military resources to address threats in the Western Hemisphere, expanding the presence of the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard to control sea lanes, combat illegal migration, and reduce human trafficking and narcotics smuggling. And here's the key part. The document explicitly states that the U.S. will use naval and air forces against vessels involved in drug smuggling, and that achieving these goals requires a more appropriate presence of American ships and aircraft in the region. In plain language, this is militarization of America's backyard and a willingness to use lethal force against threats that were previously treated as law enforcement matters, not military ones. So let me connect the dots for you. The United States is pulling back from global commitments, especially in Europe. It's refocusing on its own hemisphere. It's essentially saying that defending the southern border and controlling Latin America matters more than maintaining the transatlantic alliance, and is doing all of this while publicly stating that Europe is too weak, too divided, and too demographically altered to be counted on. For European capitals, this is a shock to the system. For decades, they've relied on American security guarantees, on the assumption that Washington would always have their back. That assumption is now officially over. Former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt didn't just call this document delirium. He said it's further to the right than the far right in Europe, that it's J.D. Vance on steroids. He pointed out that the only region where the document sees democracy under threat is Europe itself, and that the language used could only be found in the fevered fantasies of the Kremlin. Other former officials made similar comparisons, noting that the tone and content of the strategy mirror what Vladimir Putin has been saying about the decline of the West. This is unprecedented. A security strategy from the leading Western power sounds like it could have been written by its adversaries. But here's what makes this so significant. This document didn't leak. It wasn't a draft or a trial balloon. It's the official policy of the United States government, published with a foreword from the president himself. Trump called it a roadmap for keeping America the greatest and most successful nation in human history. So this is the vision. America focuses on itself and its immediate neighborhood. Europe is left to fend for itself. Alliances that have existed for over 70 years are suddenly conditional. And the condition is that Europe must radically change its approach, starting with migration, identity, and how it views its own future. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean in practice? If you're a European leader watching this unfold, what are your options? The document makes it clear that the era of unconditional American support is finished. If European countries want to maintain a relationship with Washington, they'll need to align with American priorities, which now apparently include cracking down on migration, rejecting Brussels' regulatory authority, and supporting the rise of nationalist movements. For governments that have built their entire foreign policy around the transatlantic partnership, this is a nightmare scenario. And let's talk about Ukraine for a moment. The strategy accuses European governments of pursuing unrealistic goals in the conflict and of undermining democracy in their attempts to sustain support for Kyiv. This is a direct rebuke. The United States is essentially saying that Europe's approach to the most serious security crisis on the continent in decades is misguided and damaging. Russia, meanwhile, is barely mentioned as a threat. So the message is, stop obsessing over Ukraine. Stop pretending you can counter Russia on your own and start dealing with your internal collapse. That's the strategic guidance from Washington. There's also an economic dimension here. The document describes the European Union as suffering from regulatory strangulation, with Brussels imposing rules that stifle growth and innovation. This has been a consistent theme in Trump-era rhetoric, but seeing it codified in an official security strategy is something else entirely. It suggests that the United States views the EU not as a partner in maintaining a rules-based international order, but as a bureaucratic obstacle that weakens its own member states. If that's the American view, then the entire premise of transatlantic cooperation is fundamentally broken. So where does this leave Europe? The document paints a picture of a continent that's lost its civilizational confidence, that can't defend itself militarily, that's being overwhelmed demographically, and that's trapped in a regulatory straitjacket imposed by unelected officials in Brussels. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, it's now the official American position. And if European leaders reject this diagnosis, they're left in a position where their most important ally considers them part of the problem. That's not a partnership. That's a verdict. What's also remarkable is how this strategy redefines what America considers a threat. For decades, the answer was clear: rival powers like Russia and China, rogue states, violent extremism. Now, according to this document, the threat also includes demographic change in allied countries, regulations from Brussels, and European governments that don't align with American views on migration and identity. This is a radical expansion of what gets classified as a national security concern, and it means that the United States is now treating internal European politics as a matter for American strategic interest. Let me pose a question. If the United States genuinely believes that Europe is heading towards civilizational erasure, what does that mean for NATO? The document hints at the answer. It questions whether countries that become majority non-European can remain reliable allies. If that's the standard, then NATO's future is in doubt. And if NATO's future is in doubt, then the entire security architecture of the post-World War II era is collapsing. We might be witnessing the end of the Western Alliance as we've known it for over 7 decades. And here's what I find most interesting. The document expresses optimism about the rise of patriotic European parties. These are movements that in many cases have been labeled as extremist or fringe by mainstream media and political establishments. Yet the White House is saying their growing influence is a positive development. This is an open endorsement of political forces that challenge the current European order. It's America picking sides in internal European political battles and not in favor of the incumbents. That's a huge shift. It means Washington is betting on political upheaval in Europe, not stability. Now, critics will say this strategy is rooted in prejudice, that it echoes dangerous theories about demographic replacement, that it undermines democratic norms, and those criticisms have merit. But here's the thing. This document doesn't exist in a vacuum. It reflects real anxieties, real political movements, real changes happening across the West. Whether you think those changes are existential threats or moral progress depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is that the United States government has taken a position, and that position is that Europe as it exists today is not sustainable. So let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine revival. The original doctrine was about keeping European powers out of the Americas. The Trump edition, as it's called here, is about keeping China and Russia out. But it's also about something more. It's about America turning inward, prioritizing its own hemisphere, and essentially saying that what happens in Europe or Asia is less important than what happens in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is isolationism with a regional focus. It's not America withdrawing from the world entirely. It's America withdrawing from everywhere except its immediate neighborhood. The practical implications are significant. If the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard are reallocating resources to patrol the Caribbean and intercept smuggling vessels, that means fewer resources for operations elsewhere. If American military planners are focused on the Western Hemisphere, that means less attention to European defense. If the strategic priority is controlling migration and narcotics flows from the south, that means less bandwidth for countering Russia or China globally. European allies will have to adjust to a reality where American support is no longer automatic and where Washington's attention is elsewhere. And let's be clear about what the document says regarding force. It explicitly states that the United States will use military assets against vessels involved in drug smuggling. This isn't interdiction. This isn't just boarding ships and making arrests. The language suggests something more aggressive, using naval and air forces in ways that could involve lethal action. That's a significant escalation in how the U.S. approaches what have traditionally been law enforcement issues. It's treating the drug trade and human trafficking as military threats requiring military responses. But here's the deeper question. If this document represents the new American worldview, what happens to the international order that the United States helped create? That order was built on alliances, on shared values, on the idea that democracies stick together against authoritarian challenges. If the US now believes that its democratic allies are in civilizational decline and can't be relied upon, then the foundation of that order is gone. What replaces it? The document doesn't really say. It talks about American greatness, about focusing on the Western Hemisphere, about supporting nationalist movements in Europe, but it doesn't lay out a vision for how the world is supposed to work when the United States steps back. European leaders are facing a choice. They can reject this document as delirium, as Carl Bildt did, and continue on their current path, hoping that American policy will change with the next administration. Or they can take it seriously, recognize that Washington's view of Europe has fundamentally shifted, and start making the hard decisions about how to survive in a world where they can't count on American protection. Neither option is appealing. The first risks being blindsided if this really is the new American consensus. The second requires admitting that the transatlantic alliance, the cornerstone of European security for decades, is effectively over. And that brings us to the most provocative claim in the entire document. Europe will be unrecognizable within 20 years if current trends continue. This isn't about economic decline or political dysfunction. It's about identity, about who Europeans are and whether that identity can survive demographic and cultural change. Whether you find that claim insightful or offensive probably depends on your politics. But what matters strategically is that the United States government is saying it publicly and using it to justify a historic shift in foreign policy. So here's what we're left with: a document that reads more like a manifesto than a strategy, a wholesale rejection of the idea that Europe remains a reliable partner, an embrace of nationalist movements that mainstream institutions have tried to suppress, a pivot toward the Western Hemisphere, and a revival of 19th century doctrines about American dominance in the Americas. And all of this presented not as a contingency plan, but as the official roadmap for US national security going forward. If you're in Berlin or Paris or Stockholm, you're reading this and realizing that the rules of the game have changed completely. The question isn't whether European leaders agree with the American diagnosis. The question is how they respond to a world where their most important ally has decided they're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that's the world we're living in now. The White House has spoken, Europe is dying, America is refocusing on itself, and the alliances that define the post-war era are up for renegotiation. What comes next depends on whether Europe can prove Washington wrong or whether this document will be remembered as the moment the West finally fractured for good. I'll let you decide. But whatever you conclude, don't say you weren't warned. To wrap this up, here's what you need to remember. The United States just published a security strategy that declares Europe is facing civilizational erasure within a generation, blames migration and demographic change for that decline, questions whether European allies can remain reliable, and announces a dramatic pivot toward the Western Hemisphere. Former European leaders are calling it Kremlin rhetoric, but it's official American policy. The transatlantic alliance as we've known it is over, and Europe is on its own. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, subscribe, and if you're able, consider sponsoring the channel. Your support keeps this work going, and it means we can continue bringing you the stories that matter without compromise. Thanks for watching.